Thanks, Gardner. Before I begin, I'd like to mention that my presence here is partly financed by the European Energy Programme for Recovery. So some good things do come out of Brussels. I'm afraid this is going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I believe you, despite what conspiracy theorists may think, we didn't coordinate before, but I'm going to talk about why EOR is good for CCS and CCS is good for EOR. And I might have titled my talk, I'm looking for that little bit of money that Dave says is not in CCS at the moment. So the question was, what can we do to make CCS get unstuck? And my answer is facilitate deployment of CO2 EOR with storage. My basic argument is that in these testing economic times, cost of the CCS is the principal barrier to deployment. And you can think of it in direct terms. From CCS operators cannot adequately recover their costs from market prices of low carbon products, principally electricity, and also providers of low carbon incentives to offset that market imbalance, whether they be government or directly or consumers indirectly, also have limited and seemingly these days ever shrinking resources with which to finance it. So the solution we would suggest is that oil revenue from CO2 EOR, which, as John very eloquently pointed out, is a well-established technology with huge potential here in the North Sea, can defray those costs, both for the appraisal of storage sites, their development and operation, even accounting for the additional EOR costs. And I'll give a little hypothetical illustration of that in a few minutes. Oil production taxes, as John very helpfully pointed out, may also substantially defray, or even in the best case, fully offset the incremental cost of low carbon incentives. And that would greatly stimulate the market and allow more projects to be supported beyond the small suite of industrial scale demonstration projects that we can see today. And there's an added benefit in that we get to reuse infrastructure, which is something in a world trying to become more sustainable that in principle we all like the sound of. And in a very practical commercial sense, it defers decommissioning costs not only for operators but also for the government. So, as has already been mentioned, there are abundant supplies of CO2 potentially, which may come to market over the next 5 to 10 years. There are many oil fields in the central North Sea which are suitable for CO2 EOR. We believe that it is practical to transport CO2 to those fields. As an example, the distance from the coastline of Yorkshire to the central North Sea is about 300 kilometers. And we believe that's technically and commercially feasible to transport large quantities of CO2 from that area of large emissions to where the oil is and where we can make some money. Now I'm going to give an example of a hypothetical example of what project economics might look like, which is based on experience but generalized for obvious commercial reasons. I'm going to assume that ultimate recovery is somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 3 barrels a ton of CO2 that's imported into the project, and or roughly 8 to 15% of STOA. So that's worldwide averages in the annual, biannual compendium of worldwide of EOR projects suggests that the average for well-characterized projects is about 3 barrels a ton and 12% of STOA recovery offshore. So those numbers are reasonably conservative. If I had 80 million tons of CO2, and I don't have time to justify that number, but I think that's about what you need the size that you need to make an economic project in the beginning. Then you could potentially recover somewhere in the range of 120 to 240 million barrels of oil. And that implies that you would need a very large oil field in the range, or multiple fields, that with about 800 to 1.5 billion barrels of STOIIP. That also would require a significant number of wells, somewhere in the range of 25 to 60 wells. Now, then we come to the costs. In this example, we assume that we're providing new facilities which cost in the range of £0.5 to £1 billion for CO2 import injection, most importantly, produced gas handling. So we're looking at in a range of 3 up to 800 million scuffs a day of CO2 for a project of this size. Also, and to support all that equipment, we would have a new steel jacket and platform, presumably bridge linked to an existing platform, because that's the sensible way to do this thing. And of course, there's an allowance for installation, hookup, and commissioning. Then we've got the wells, which can be a very significant, as much as half of the capex. We're assuming that we would need to work over all of the wells for CO2 service. We would probably need to drill some wells, and we would also have to carry out a significant number of abandonments to assure CO2 integrity. OPEX would be in the range of 70 to 90 million pounds a year of all the usual items, plus some extra costs for CO2 storage monitoring and costs of storage permits and lease, etc. So here's some numbers. You won't be able to work out very much from these, other than this implies the example I give has a capex of somewhere between 0.7 to 1.7 billion pounds over the 20 years. OPEX is about 1.4 to 1.8. CO2 transportation, or it could be purchase of CO2, would be in the range of 1 to 3 billion pounds. And then there would also potentially be, there could be revenue for storage fees, which might be nothing, or I'm saying in this case that it could be up to 1.5 billion pounds. And most importantly, there's oil revenue. So $75 a barrel, the numbers I gave you work out to 6 to 12 billion pounds over the life of the project. If you were to take current oil prices, which is actually a lot closer to DEC's new forecast for oil prices, then multiply by about 1 1/3 for those numbers. So, potentially up to 16 or more billion pounds of revenue. That also generates a large amount of production tax. At current rates, it's substantially more than 50% of the revenue, and even in an incentivized environment, half is probably a good number. So this project, if you can make it economic, would potentially generate anywhere from 3 to 9 billion pounds of revenue for the exchequer at $75, and significantly more at higher prices. So what these numbers show, I hope, in a very general sense, and I believe in a lot more detail, is that that North Sea EOR is potentially economic, and that is that you can get back more money than you put in, with relatively conservative assumptions about oil price and recovery, and that would be true over a range of scenarios. However, many of those potentially economic scenarios would not achieve a commercial rate of return that would be commensurate with the risks. And like it or not, and either John or Gardner pointed out one of the conundrums in this business, which is that CO2 EOR is a great way to store CO2, but it's not necessarily a particularly attractive way to produce oil. And unfortunately, if you want to store CO2 in an EOR project, you're depending on oil companies. And people who produce oil have other options. And so in order to enable this, you have to be able to see returns that are commensurate with the risks, that are also commensurate with other opportunities that the people have the skills, the capital, the know-how that actually build one of these projects. So that leads me to my final point. What does it take to get those people doing CO2 EOR and creating this benefit for us? First one is pretty easy, I think, which is the regulatory framework that facilitates CO2 EOR. On paper, at least we have that. Now, it has yet been untested on a real development, but I'm quite confident that that will work. there's one niggling problem which still remains, which is some workable provisions for the post-injection period, handover of CO2 storage liability eventually to the state, and most particularly the provisions for financial security. A number of us in this room have been quite involved in this issue. More importantly, and John has already mentioned this, is taxation. I think that moving a significant number of those economic scenarios from being economic but not commercial to being economic and commercial is something that will require some kind of taxation incentive for CO2 EOR or perhaps for EOR in general. And that could be something like reduced rates of petroleum revenue tax or field allowances that would help to offset the capital cost early in the life of the project. As John said, I think, and I could demonstrate with numerical models, that actually the revenue that would accrue from a small reduction in the rate of tax would greatly exceed anything that you would forego in the short term. So the prize for all this with CO2 EOR and storage is that we can get cost-effective, secure CO2 storage that actually potentially creates a demand, creates a pool for some of that CO2 to be captured on shore. It creates potentially new revenue for government that would not otherwise be had, and that potentially offsets the money that's needed to incentivize low-carbon power generation and carbon capture in the first place. In the process, it also defers decommissioning costs, which is good for everybody. And finally, it's an opportunity to enhance highly paid exportable skills and levels of employment in the North Sea oil industry, which most of us is near and dear to our hearts. So thanks very much for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Jim. We'll actually just bash on.
Okay.
And we are going to have that panel session at the end, so just to keep us on time.